Looking at the catastrophe of the 19th century, we see a pattern emerging across continents. Empty cities frozen in photographs. Millions of orphans appearing without explanation. Buildings buried under impossible volumes of earth. These aren't separate mysteries. They're pieces of the same puzzle. Fragments of an event that reshaped our world and was then carefully erased from memory. The photographs don't lie. When we examine images from the 1860s and 70s, we see something that shouldn't exist. Magnificent urban centers, complete with grand architecture and sophisticated infrastructure, standing almost completely abandoned. The chimneys rise into empty skies, but no smoke emerges. The streets stretch for blocks, but only one or two figures appear in the frame, their solitude emphasizing the vast emptiness around them. This isn't the gradual abandonment of a failing settlement. This is something else entirely. These cities weren't slowly dying. They were interrupted, paused mid-sentence, as if their inhabitants simply vanished overnight, leaving behind everything they'd built. Official history offers no satisfactory explanation for this phenomenon. We're told about economic migrations, about people moving westward in search of opportunity. But that narrative fails to account for what we actually see. Economic migration doesn't leave behind fully functioning cities in perfect condition. It doesn't create the kind of absolute demographic vacuum captured in these images. The standard explanations crumble under examination. If people were merely relocating for better prospects, why abandon magnificent structures that represented generations of investment and labor? Why leave behind the infrastructure of civilization itself? The logic doesn't hold. But the mystery of the empty cities is only the beginning. Because while some urban centers stood abandoned, something else was happening simultaneously across the globe. An event so massive in scope that it still defies adequate explanation today. The 19th century witnessed an explosion of orphans on a scale never seen before or since. We're not talking about localized tragedies affecting individual communities. This was a worldwide phenomenon. Hundreds of thousands, perhaps millions of children appearing without parents, without families, without any clear origin. The infrastructure required to handle this demographic tsunami materialized with astonishing speed. In Great Britain alone, more than 64 large orphanages were established during this period. And that's just a partial count from available records. A single institution might house 4,500 infants. Multiply that across continents, and the numbers become staggering. Where did these children come from? The official answers point to wars, industrialization, disease. But these explanations don't match the scale of what occurred. Wars create orphans, certainly, but the conflicts of that era weren't sufficient to account for millions of parentless children appearing simultaneously around the world. The Industrial Revolution brought hardship, but it didn't erase entire populations of adults while somehow leaving their children behind. The epidemics of the period were real and deadly, but they too fail to explain the specific nature of this crisis. Diseases don't discriminate so precisely that they would wipe out parents while sparing children in such massive numbers. The demographic profile doesn't match any known pattern of epidemic mortality. Something else happened. Something that created a generation of children without history, without families, without any connection to the world that came before. And here's where the two mysteries begin to converge. The empty cities needed inhabitants. The orphans needed homes. The timing of these phenomena isn't coincidental. They're synchronized, as if one was the problem and the other was the solution. Consider the logistics. Cities across America, Europe, and beyond stood ready for occupation, their buildings intact, their streets laid out, their infrastructure functional. At the same moment in history, a massive population of children materialized, disconnected from any prior social structure, ready to be integrated into new communities. This wasn't gradual demographic change. This was systematic repopulation. The orphan trains of America provide the clearest example. More than 200,000 children were transported from eastern cities to settlements across the Midwest between the mid-1800s and the early 20th century. The official narrative frames this as humanitarian social work, finding homes for unfortunate children from overcrowded urban areas. But look at the scale. 200,000 children, systematically distributed across vast territories to populate towns and farms. This wasn't charity. This was planned settlement, using human resources that appeared precisely when and where they were needed.
The postcards of the era tell a story that has been hiding in plain sight for over a century. At first glance, they seem like quirky period pieces, examples of Victorian sentimentality or odd humor. But examine them closely. Study their imagery, their captions, their distribution patterns. What emerges is something far more disturbing than whimsical art. These weren't greeting cards. They were catalogs. The images repeat obsessively across thousands of variations. Children emerging from cabbage patches, infants hatching from eggs, babies growing on trees or floating in shells. The surreal quality of these scenes has allowed them to hide in our collective consciousness as harmless oddities. But the text that accompanies these images strips away any innocent interpretation. The French phrase appears again and again, à vendre, for sale. Not as metaphor, not as jest, as direct commercial announcement. One postcard depicts what it explicitly calls a modern baby bazaar. The caption lists terms that belong to mercantile transaction, free entry, no competition, everything for sale. And then the chilling addendum: we do not accept returns. This is retail language applied to human beings. Other cards function as product listings. Each infant comes with a description of qualities designed to appeal to potential buyers. I will be good. I won't wet the bed. I am cheerful. I will love you. These aren't artistic flourishes. They're selling points, features to help a customer make their selection. The children in many of these images don't look happy. Some are crying. Others appear frightened or confused. In several postcards, infants are shown in cages, like animals at a market. The caption on one such image leaves no room for misinterpretation. Children for sale. Do you want a baby? This wasn't hidden. This was public, widespread, accepted. These cards were mailed through official postal systems, bought and sold openly, produced in massive quantities across multiple countries. They've survived in collections, in antique shops, in museum archives. They've been visible all along. We simply chose not to see what they were showing us. The fairy tales we tell children take on new meaning in this context. The stork bringing babies wasn't just a charming way to avoid awkward conversations. It was cultural memory of an actual delivery system. The postcards show storks wearing postal uniforms, carrying scales to weigh their cargo, transporting multiple infants in bags or baskets. The Cabbage Patch wasn't innocent fiction. It was symbolic representation of mass cultivation. The images literally show children growing in fields, arranged in rows like crops, ready for harvest. These weren't metaphors created centuries ago and passed down through oral tradition. These were contemporary references, created by people who knew exactly what they were depicting because they lived through it. The infrastructure for child distribution existed openly. The orphan trains weren't operating in secret. The orphanages weren't hidden. The postcards advertising children for purchase circulated through normal commercial channels. This was all visible, all documented, all preserved in the historical record. So why don't we know about it? Why doesn't this appear in our history books, our academic studies, our collective understanding of the 19th century? Because acknowledging it would require acknowledging what created the need for it. And that leads us to questions that demolish the entire framework of accepted history. The Great Fire excuse appears everywhere. Nearly every Gothic cathedral, every ancient stone structure, comes with a legend of a previous wooden church that burned down, conveniently making way for the magnificent replacement. This template repeats so often it can no longer be considered coincidence. Rheims Cathedral, Notre Dame, countless others across Europe, each supposedly built on the ashes of a humbler predecessor that was destroyed by fire just before construction began on the new masterwork. But look at what we're being asked to believe. Primitive medieval societies, lacking electricity, lacking modern tools, lacking the mathematical and engineering knowledge that would emerge centuries later, somehow responded to these fires by erecting structures of such sophistication that modern architects struggle to explain them. The logistics don't work. The technology doesn't work. The timeline doesn't work. Unless we accept that these buildings weren't built by the people we're told built them, unless we accept that they already existed, and the fire stories were invented to explain why magnificent structures appeared in an era that supposedly lacked the capacity to create them. The same pattern appears in American cities. The Great Chicago Fire of 1871, the San Francisco earthquake and fire of 1906, the Seattle fire of 1889, each followed by a period of remarkable reconstruction that produced architectural marvels supposedly impossible for their time. These events created convenient historical breaks, points at which the narrative could be reset, allowing pre-existing structures to be incorporated into a new timeline without raising uncomfortable questions about their actual origins. But the fires and earthquakes, real as some of them may have been, don't explain the primary phenomenon we've been examining. They don't explain the buried buildings, the catastrophic soil deposits, the complete demographic disruption of the 19th century. For that, we need to look at something bigger, something global, something that affected coastal and inland regions simultaneously, that could generate both massive water displacement and unprecedented atmospheric disturbance. The evidence points to multiple catastrophic forces acting in concert. In coastal areas like Seattle, buildings were buried under what appears to have been a massive influx of soil with glacial characteristics. The methods used to remove this material, particularly the use of high-pressure water cannons, mirror exactly the techniques used to deal with permafrost in Alaska. This wasn't normal Earth. It was frozen, or had been frozen. The term glacial hills, used in official documents describing Seattle's terrain, isn't just geological classification, it's literal description. These were hills of ice and mud that had to be thawed and washed away. The ice tsunami hypothesis explains this perfectly. A massive wave, not of water alone, but of ice, mud, and debris, swept inland from the Pacific. The enormous ice content of this surge caused it to freeze after impact, creating the glacial deposits that later had to be systematically melted and removed. But Kansas City presents a completely different scenario. No tsunami, no matter how massive, could reach a city nearly 900 feet above sea level in the center of the continent. Yet buildings there were buried even deeper than those in Seattle, under 23 feet of soil. The terrain pattern around Kansas City suggests a different cause entirely. The undulating, dune-like formations, the absence of mature trees, the preservation of structures under loose, dry material, all point to aerial deposition rather than waterborne catastrophe. Apocalyptic dust storms. Sand and soil lifted from the landscape by winds of unimaginable force, driven across vast distances, burying everything in their path. Not quickly like a tsunami, but relentlessly, over months or years, accumulating against buildings, filling streets, entombing cities without destroying their structure. We see this process happening in miniature today in places like the Russian village of Shoina, where desert encroachment is literally swallowing houses. Extend that phenomenon to continental scale, driven by atmospheric disturbance far beyond anything in recorded modern history, and you begin to understand what might have occurred.
Two different catastrophes, two different mechanisms, same result. Cities buried, populations displaced or destroyed, civilization interrupted. This requires us to think bigger. What kind of event could trigger both massive oceanic displacement and continent-scale atmospheric disruption simultaneously? What could cause ice tsunamis on the coasts while generating devastating dust storms in the interior? The answer must be planetary in scope. Not a local disaster, not even a regional cataclysm, but a global environmental collapse that manifested differently depending on geography and elevation. Cosmic impact remains a possibility. A large asteroid or comet strike, or perhaps multiple impacts, could generate the kind of cascading effects we're seeing evidence for. The initial impact would create massive tsunamis. The debris thrown into the atmosphere would alter climate patterns, potentially triggering the kind of persistent windstorms that could strip and redistribute continental soil. Massive volcanic activity could produce similar results. Super eruptions, throwing enough material into the atmosphere to darken skies for years, disrupting weather patterns, creating the conditions for both flooding and dust storms on unprecedented scales. Solar events might play a role. Significant changes in solar output or massive coronal mass ejections could alter Earth's climate and weather systems dramatically enough to trigger the kind of environmental chaos we're inferring. Or it could be something else entirely. Some combination of factors, some cascade of natural and perhaps artificial events that our current civilization has chosen to forget rather than remember. What we know for certain is that the evidence exists. The photographs are real. The buried buildings are real. The millions of orphans were real. The postcards advertising children for sale are real. These aren't conspiracy theories or speculation. They're documented facts that don't fit the historical narrative we've been given. The question becomes, why the cover-up? Why construct an elaborate false history rather than acknowledge what actually happened? Perhaps because the truth is too destabilizing. If people understood that our current civilization is only a century and a half old, that everything before that point is either fabrication or misunderstood inheritance from a previous world, the implications would be profound. All claims of cultural continuity would collapse. National identities built on ancient histories would lose their foundations. Religious traditions, supposedly millennia old, would be revealed as recent constructions. The entire social order depends on the belief in historical continuity, in the unbroken chain connecting us to the distant past. Break that chain. Admit that there was a reset, a break in civilization so severe that it nearly wiped out human life on Earth, and you open questions that those in power would rather not face. Where did the previous civilization come from? What were they capable of? What knowledge did they possess that's now lost? Are we truly their descendants, or something else? And most importantly, could it happen again? The buried first floors visible in cities around the world aren't cultural layers accumulated over centuries. They're the high water mark of catastrophe. They show us exactly how deep the destruction reached. Every buried window, every basement that was once a ground floor, every excavated structure is a monument to an event we're not supposed to remember. The empty cities weren't abandoned through normal demographic processes. They were cleared by catastrophe, and then repopulated through systematic programs using the orphan population that appeared in the aftermath. The magnificent architecture we attribute to primitive medieval builders wasn't constructed by them. It was inherited from before, survived the catastrophe, and then had its origins disguised through invented histories of fires and reconstruction. The fairy tales about storks and cabbage patches aren't innocent children's stories. They're cultural memory of how the post-catastrophe world was repopulated,
how children were cultivated and distributed to fill the empty spaces left behind. The evidence has been visible all along. We simply weren't asking the right questions. We accepted the narrative we were given because questioning it seemed absurd. Who would lie about history on such a massive scale? What would be the point? But once you see the pattern, once you recognize what the photographs and documents are actually showing you, the historical narrative becomes impossible to maintain. The contradictions are too numerous, too fundamental. The official story doesn't just have holes, it's entirely fabricated. A framework imposed on inherited ruins to hide the truth about what came before. Our world has been reset. Not in the distant past, not in prehistory, but recently.
Within living memory of the great-great-grandparents of people alive today. The 19th century wasn't a time of progress and industrial revolution building on medieval foundations. It was a time of recovery from near extinction, of relearning civilization from scratch, of repopulating an empty world using whatever human resources were available. The children in the orphanages, the figures on the postcards, they weren't victims of normal social displacement. They were the seeds of a new humanity, cultivated by methods we can barely imagine, distributed according to a plan we're only beginning to perceive. Were they naturally born? Were they products of some technology we no longer possess? The incubator exhibits at World's Fairs, where premature babies were displayed as attractions while eugenics expositions occurred nearby, suggest possibilities that challenge everything we think we know about human reproduction and development. The elite who organized this repopulation, who created the false histories, who built the systems that became our modern world, they knew the truth. They had to. You can't execute a global population program without understanding what you're responding to, without knowing what really happened. That knowledge has been passed down through certain channels, preserved in secret societies, hidden in plain sight through symbols and architecture. The very buildings that survived the catastrophe carry messages in their design, clues to what came before, if you know how to read them. The Tartarian architecture, the magnificent structures found worldwide with similar characteristics despite being supposedly built by different unconnected cultures, these aren't coincidences. They're evidence of a unified global civilization that existed before the reset. A civilization so far advanced beyond our own that we can barely comprehend their capabilities. They built the cathedrals, the castles, the grand civic buildings we see in every major city. They created the infrastructure, the sewers and waterworks and power systems we attribute to 19th century engineering. They established the cities we live in today. And then something destroyed them. Something so powerful it buried cities under 20 feet of earth, froze coastal regions in glacial deposits, stripped the soil from entire continents. Something that killed enough people to create the demographic vacuum that had to be filled with manufactured orphans. Was it natural? Was it war? Was it something else entirely? Something that doesn't fit our current understanding of what's possible? We don't have all the answers, but we have enough evidence to know that the questions are real, that the official history is false, that everything we've been taught about the 19th century and the time before it is carefully constructed misdirection. The truth is buried, not just metaphorically, but literally. It's under our feet, in the basements that were once ground floors, in the lower levels of buildings now below street level, in the soil that had to be excavated from city centers and dumped into the sea. It's in the photographs, showing us cities without people and people without history. It's in the postcards, advertising human beings for sale to repopulate an empty world. It's in the orphanages, the scale of which makes no sense unless you understand what they were really for. It's in the methods used to remove glacial hills from Seattle, methods identical to those used for permafrost, because that's what they were dealing with. Frozen catastrophe made solid, preserved until someone decided to melt it away and pretend it was just ordinary earth that needed leveling. It's in the Kansas City photographs, showing buildings buried to their roofs in loose soil, terrain that looks nothing like flood deposits because it wasn't water that put it there. It was wind. Storms of such magnitude they rewrote the landscape. It's in every buried window, every excavated basement, every structure that has a first floor underground. These aren't accidents of sediment accumulation. They're evidence of an event so massive it changed the surface level of the Earth across entire regions. The world was buried. Then it was dug out. Then the digging was explained away as street improvement and urban planning, as if moving mountains of earth through cities was a routine engineering project rather than desperate recovery from catastrophe. The people were gone. Then orphans appeared in numbers that make no demographic sense. Then they were distributed through systems that operated openly, publicly, commercially, advertising children like any other commodity. And then we forgot this happened, or were made to forget, because remembering would mean acknowledging the reset. How much time actually separates us from the catastrophe? The photographs suggest it was still actively being dealt with in the 1860s and 70s.
The excavation of cities continued into the early 20th century. The orphan programs ran for decades after that. We might be only 4 or 5 generations removed from the event itself. Your great-great-grandparents might have been among the orphans, raised without knowledge of their true origins, integrated into a society that was itself only just reforming after near total collapse. The implications are staggering. If civilization was reset that recently, then modernity as we know it has existed for barely more than a century. All claims of continuous development from medieval or ancient times are false. We're not the inheritors of millennia of gradual progress. We're the survivors of catastrophe, rebuilding on ruins we don't understand, using technology we inherited but can't fully replicate. That's why we can't build Gothic cathedrals despite having vastly superior tools and knowledge. We didn't build the originals. We don't actually know how it was done because we're not the civilization that did it. That's why so much historical documentation is questionable, why dating methods give conflicting results, why official timelines contain impossible compressions of achievement. The timeline itself is false, constructed to hide the break, to create appearance of continuity where none exists. That's why our cities look the way they do. Beautiful old centers surrounded by modern development of clearly inferior quality. The centers weren't built by us. We just moved back in after they were excavated and tried to maintain them as best we could. Everything makes sense once you understand there was a reset. The empty cities needed inhabitants. The orphans needed homes. The buried buildings needed excavation. The missing history needed invention. It all fits together once you stop accepting the narrative and start looking at what the evidence actually shows. We live in a recovered world, not a continuously developed one. Our civilization rose from the ashes of something greater, something we've been taught to forget, something that left behind ruins so magnificent we had to invent elaborate lies about primitive peoples with hammers and chisels to explain their existence. The truth has been hidden, but it hasn't been destroyed. It's still there, waiting to be rediscovered. In every photograph of an empty 19th century city, in every postcard advertising babies for sale, in every buried window and excavated basement, in every magnificent building we can't explain and can't replicate. The secret of the 19th century isn't just that there was a catastrophe, it's that we survived it, barely, and then built an entirely false history to cover up what actually happened. We live in a lie constructed by our recent ancestors, a lie designed to give us comforting continuity instead of uncomfortable truth. But the truth is emerging anyway. The more we look, the more we find. The more we question, the more the official story falls apart. We're reaching a point where the evidence can no longer be ignored, where the contradictions have become too obvious to dismiss. What happens when enough people understand what really occurred? when the comfortable narrative of gradual historical progress collapses under the weight of its own impossibilities, when we can no longer avoid seeing that our world is built on ruins, populated by descendants of orphans, governed by inheritors of a cover-up. Perhaps nothing changes. Perhaps people prefer the lie. Perhaps acknowledging the reset is too disturbing, too destructive to our sense of identity and place in history. Or perhaps everything changes. Perhaps understanding our true past, recent and catastrophic as it is, allows us to ask new questions about who we are, about what we're capable of, about what the previous civilization knew that we've forgotten, about whether the cycle might repeat. The buried cities have been excavated, but the buried truth remains underground, waiting for us to dig deep enough to find it. This isn't ancient history. This is the story of our great-grandparents, of the world they lived through and the secrets they kept. The evidence surrounds us. We just need to see it.